So Dr. Andrew Root, who's a professor of practical theology at Luther Seminary, wrote a book called The Grace of Dogs, and he opens that book up describing in a very emotional way the poignant loss of their 11-year-old family dog named Kirby, a black lab who had grown old and sick with cancer. And he describes how the family surrounded Kirby in the vet's office as they were about to put him to sleep, and especially how his 8-year-old son, Owen, who was heartbroken, understandably, and who was hugging Kirby, and announced that he wanted his face to be the last face Kirby sees. And Andrew Root describes the very real grief of that moment that Kirby passed away. But he remembers most is an image that comes to him. Remembers most his son telling everyone in that room that he would be right back and leaving the room, then returning with a dog treat and a cup of water. A tiny paper cup he had filled with water. And silently and purposely, Owen knelt before Kirby's body, placed the tiny bone on Kirby's back, dipped his finger in the cup of water, and reverently made the sign of the cross on Kirby's forehead. Then he lifted his hands to heaven like he was a priest at the altar, looked up and whispered, "I love you, Kirby. Goodbye." In the weeks following, Dr. Root wondered what was it that image really stuck with him in the midst of their grief, that image of his son doing that. And he wondered to himself, what was this thing they had experienced with this animal? Why did the loss hurt so much? Why did his son's act seem so right, as he said, in its sacramental feel? So Dr. Root decided he was going to explore the science of dog and humans. He went and studied the biology. He went and studied how animals' minds work. He looked at paleontology. He went to the scientists to try to understand and try to discover how, if you move beyond a kind of sentimentality, that the dog-human connection can legitimately be described, as he experienced, as spiritual. As existing not for the sake of gain for anyone, but for the unselfish desire to be with and for the other that they experienced in their dog Kirby. And to remind us that all creatures are worthy of love and able to share love. Dr. Root, who's written many books on theology in a secular age, says this one book, The Grace of Dogs, has had more greater impact on people's thinking than anything else. And it does seem like an odd thing for a Christian theologian to be wrestling with the question of, do dogs have souls? And by extension, it may also seem to be an odd thing that this season of Lent we will be exploring the connections between creation and nature and our discipleship. It somehow maybe feels like an odd thing to do during Lent. A more traditional Lent approach, of course, we'd focus on sin and redemption and focus on human salvation and a journey to the cross and beyond. Appropriate questions for sure for all of our spiritual lives. The problem is this sole focus on the human soul and its fate. The problem is it's not really truly biblical or theological. It's not very good theology, to be honest. So let's take the story of creation we read this morning, which through the years, let's be honest, the story of creation has been interpreted to support such things as the source of sin in our lives, to support such things as the oppression and subjugation of women in the world. Treatment of creation is something we have, and you will hear in the first chapter of Genesis, a dominion over creation. In other words, creation in nature is something to be used and in many cases abused for our benefit. When in actuality, if one really reads the story and pays attention, the story of creation specifically in the second chapter of Genesis presents a really far different picture than the one many of us carry around in ourselves. And this story we read this morning expresses a number of meaningful understandings of human beings and their place in the world. First of all, there is Adam. Now, I don't know if many of you know, but Adam is actually a Hebrew word for human being. And actually, Adam is a description of the black soil of the earth. And the emphasis, and in many ways, Adam means black earth. From dust you shall be created. It's soil that Adam, that human beings are created. So the connection from the very beginning of Genesis between human beings and the land is emphasized. It's inseparable. That our connection to earth is profound. We are creatures of the earth, not to be separated. And in fact, the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures, and we'll be exploring in the coming weeks, are filled with stories about the way human beings treat the soil, treat the land, becomes a profound way of showing our faithfulness over and over in the Hebrew Scriptures. We are earth, soil. And then, not only is that connection profoundly made by naming human beings the black soil, but God commands Adam to till and keep the land. Now, what's interesting is that we often hear in our head the sense in Genesis 1, the emphasis on the dominion over the land, the idea of stewardship. But really, the Hebrew word here for till and keep is more correctly translated as service. That in other words, God commands human beings to serve the land. That the working in the land is simply not something for our benefit or our human sake, but actually for the land itself. So whether one is farming or whether one is working in a garden, it's a form of servanthood to the land. And thirdly, if you notice in the story as God says it's not good that humans should be alone. It goes the line. And human beings need a helper and a partner. And I don't know if you notice this, but what God does first is God creates out of the same soil, out of the same earth, God makes every living animal in the field and every bird of the air. God, in an odd way, makes animals our companions, our partners between humanity and the very animals God created. And it occurs to me, what would it mean if we saw animals not simply as these creatures separate from ourselves, but actually, what if we see these creatures not as something to be subdued and ornament, but actually brothers and sisters a lot like the Canticle by the St. Francis of Assisi, the sense in which we understand ourselves to be connected in this much larger community. What if we saw creation and nature as partners? Because truth be told, the Scriptures understand the world in that way. And the truth is that sin only enters into this story when human beings separate themselves from creation, from all living things. The problem occurs when humans treat nature and each other as things to be subdued and used. That sin is disconnection and domination. Now, we know this to be true. At the deepest part of ourselves, if we look deep within us, we know this is true because we have felt abhorrence when we see this disconnection and dominance. I mean, maybe that's easy to see in what's happening in Ukraine. Or when we see images of the pollution of the earth and the abuse of the earth. Or the destruction of species around the planet. The first step in our opening up and connecting to this larger community that we are a part of human beings and all creatures, is like Owen to see the holy in a beloved animal. That in many ways, our spiritual journey this season of Lent is to open our hearts to that possibility, and in so doing, maybe to open our hearts and minds to a new way of seeing ourselves living together and connected. It is to hold as holy those animals that are a part of this creation which we are a part of and live in need. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.